The morning I arrived at Blackthorn Hall, 3 crows landed on the iron gate and refused to move, old superstition. That's what I told myself as the carriage wheels crunched over frostbitten gravel, and the enormous estate swallowed the horizon whole. I was 23 years old, freshly orphaned, and, as of 6 weeks prior, the newly betrothed wife of Aldric Voss, the Duke of Blackthorn. I should have paid attention to the crows. They say the last duchess never made it past her 7th month. My lady's maid, Petra, whispered from the seat beside me, her voice barely audible above the rattling of the carriage. Petra. I gave her a warning look, and the one before her, Lady Seraphine, she vanished on a Thursday. Just gone. No body, no farewell letter, no Petra. She pressed her lips together, but her eyes said everything her mouth had just been silenced from saying. I turned back to the window. The hall loomed closer now, a sprawling stone fortress wrapped in winter ivy, its towers cutting into a sky so gray it looked like it had given up on color entirely. Every window was dark except one. The topmost window, far right tower. Someone stood there, watching. By the time I blinked, they were gone. My name is Isolde Farren, and I had not married for love. I want to make that clear from the beginning, because what follows might otherwise make no sense. I married Aldric Voss because my father's estate had collapsed under debt I didn't know existed until the lawyers arrived 3 days after his funeral. I married him because the alternative was a workhouse or a cousin's charity, and I had far too much pride for either. Aldric was 38, distinguished in the way that old money always is, sharp jaw, silver threading through dark hair at his temples, eyes so deeply blue they looked almost violet in certain light. He was not unkind when we met. He was not particularly warm either. He shook my hand at our introduction like I was a business associate, and spent most of our brief courtship discussing the terms of the marriage contract with my father's solicitor rather than speaking to me directly. I told myself I could live with that. What I hadn't told myself, what I had carefully avoided thinking about, were the rumors. 4 wives, 4 disappearances. Every queen who married this duke disappeared before childbirth. That was what the village women said. Not the nobility. The nobility smiled politely and changed the subject when Aldric's name came up. But the women who sold bread at the Thornwick market, the ones who had grown up in the shadow of Blackthorn Hall, they said it plainly. They said it like they were warning me about bad weather. I hadn't listened. Now, stepping out of the carriage onto the frost-cracked stone steps of Blackthorn Hall, with my 2 trunks and my stubborn pride and absolutely no one in this world who would come looking for me if I disappeared, I wondered if I had made a catastrophic mistake. Aldric was waiting in the entrance hall. He looked exactly as I remembered him from our 3 brief meetings in London, controlled, composed, dressed impeccably in charcoal and black. But there was something different about him here, on his own ground. He was larger, somehow. Or maybe it was just that the hall made everything feel smaller. The ceiling soared 30 feet above us, hung with iron chandeliers that hadn't been fully lit in what looked like years. Portraits lined the walls, row upon row of women in silk and velvet, all of them watching me with painted eyes that somehow conveyed pity. "Welcome to Blackthorn, Miss Farren," he said. "Or Duchess Voss, I should say. We're not yet married," I reminded him. Something crossed his face. "Not Haitian, something quieter than that." "No, not yet." He showed me to my rooms himself, which surprised me. I had expected a housekeeper. Instead, it was Aldric who led me through corridor after corridor, up 2 flights of stairs, to a suite of rooms that faced the eastern gardens. The furniture was beautiful, old, heavy, expensive, but there was a stillness to the room that felt less like peace and more like something that had been holding its breath for a long time. This was. I started, then stopped. Lady Seraphine's rooms, he confirmed without turning around. He was adjusting the fire poker near the grate. I had them refreshed. New linens, new curtains, how considerate. He turned then and looked at me for a long moment. "I know what they say about me, Miss Farren." I met his gaze. "Do you?" "Yes." He set the poker down. "I thought you should know. I did not harm any of them. The room was very quiet." "Then where are they?" I asked. He said nothing. He simply looked at me with those almost violet eyes, and then he left, pulling the door gently closed behind him. The wedding was small, just a vicar, 2 witnesses from the village, Petra, and a cold Tuesday morning in the hall's private chapel. Aldric placed a ring on my finger, sapphires, very old, surrounded by roses etched in gold, and said his vows in a clear, steady voice. I said mine in a voice I worked hard to keep equally steady. When it was done, he kissed my hand, not my lips, my hand. Then he returned to his study, and I returned to my rooms, and that was how the marriage of Aldric and Isolde Voss began. The staff were few and oddly quiet. There was Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, a woman built like a wardrobe, with a face that had apparently long ago decided against unnecessary expressions. There was a groundskeeper named Crisp, who I never once saw smile. There were 2 kitchen maids, a footman, and a butler named Graves who moved so silently I half wondered if he was actually a ghost. On my 3rd day as Duchess, I asked Mrs. Holt about the West Wing. She went very still. "The West Wing is not in use," she said. I noticed it was locked. "Yes." "Why?" She turned to straighten a vase that did not need straightening. "His Grace prefers it that way. Has it always been locked?" A pause. "Since Lady Maren, the 2nd wife." I had read what I could find about them. There wasn't much. Lady Maren Ashfield, married 7 years ago, disappeared in her 6th month of pregnancy. No body recovered. Case closed by the local magistrate with suspicious efficiency. "What happened to Lady Maren?" I asked. Mrs. Holt finally turned and looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. It wasn't hostility. It was something that looked dangerously close to warning. "I wouldn't go looking for answers about things that aren't your business, Your Grace." "I am the Duchess of Blackthorn," I said quietly. "Everything in this house is my business." She left without another word. Petra found me the key on the 15th day. She didn't tell me where she got it. She simply appeared in my sitting room after supper with a small iron key and a face that said she had already argued with herself extensively about whether to bring it and had arrived at a fragile peace with the decision. "If you don't come back out," she said, pressing it into my palm, "I'm going for help." From whom we're 40 miles from the nearest city. Then I'll walk. I loved Petra enormously in that moment. I waited until just past midnight when the house had settled into its particular kind of silence, the kind that felt less like sleep and more like watching. I took a candle and the iron key and made my way down the east corridor, across the gallery, and to the door at the far end of the north hall that everyone pretended didn't exist. The key fit. The door swung open with a groan that seemed far too loud in the sleeping house, and the smell that rolled out, dust, and something chemical, and underneath it all, something sweet and faintly wrong, made me take a step backward before I forced myself forward. The West Wing had once been beautiful. You could still see it, in the bones of the rooms, in the ornate plasterwork on the ceilings, in the remnants of wallpaper that had been silk once, printed with birds of paradise and climbing roses. But everything was coated in years of dust and neglect. Sheet-covered furniture hulked in the shadows like sleeping animals. My candle flame bent and shuddered in drafts from places I couldn't identify. I moved through 3 empty rooms before I found the one that mattered. It was a study, smaller than Aldric's, but with the same overwhelming sense of papers and research. Books stacked on every surface, journals piled on a desk so cluttered it looked like a physical argument. A chalkboard on one wall, covered in writing, with a velvet curtain pulled across it. A glass cabinet in the corner, filled with bottles, medical bottles. Tinctures, tonics, powders, labeled in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Some labels had been partially torn away. Others bore names I vaguely knew from my limited education in herbal medicine. But several of them bore names I had never seen anywhere. And there on the desk, half hidden beneath a stack of journals, a photograph, 4 women, each one in a separate frame like a collection. All of them beautiful, all of them wearing the sapphire ring currently on my finger. Lady Estelle, Lady Maren, Lady Corinne, Lady Seraphine. Below each portrait, written in small, careful script, were dates: marriage date, conception date, last recorded date. None of them had made it past month 7. My candle flame went out. And behind me, in the darkness of the West Wing, someone said my name. Isolde. I spun around. My heart was so loud in my ears that the silence seemed to ring with it. In the doorway of the study, holding a lamp, was Aldric. He looked at the photograph in my hands. Then he looked at me. Neither of us spoke for what felt like a very long time. "You found it?" he finally said. "I found them," I corrected. My voice came out steadier than I felt. 4 women, 4 wives, all gone before childbirth. I held up the photograph. "What did you do to them?" He stepped into the room. I stepped back. He noticed and stopped. "I did not harm them." "Then where are they?" My voice cracked this time. I hated it. "You keep saying that. You didn't harm them. But 4 women are gone, Aldric. 4 women. And all of their last recorded dates are in this book, on this desk, in a locked wing of your house. What am I supposed to believe?" He set the lamp on the desk and sat down heavily in the chair behind it. He was still in his evening clothes. He'd been working late, clearly. He pressed one hand over his face and stayed like that for a moment. When he dropped his hand, he looked older, exhausted in a way that his composure usually kept hidden. "My mother died in childbirth," he said. "I was the child. I waited. My father, who was a brilliant and deeply broken man, spent the remaining years of his life trying to understand why. He was convinced that there was something hereditary, something in the Voss bloodline that was incompatible with successful pregnancy. He looked at the cabinet of bottles. He dedicated himself to finding a solution. He believed he was close when he died. I lowered the photograph slowly. And you continued his research? Yes. And your wives? They all knew. His jaw tightened. Before we married, I told each of them what my father had discovered. I told them about the risk. They agreed to participate, to allow me to monitor their health closely, to take certain tonics during the pregnancy, to follow specific protocols. A pause. Lady Estelle was the first. She fell ill in her 6th month despite everything. We transferred her to a facility in Vienna where she could receive care I couldn't provide here. She's alive, Isolde. She's been there for 11 years. I sat down on the edge of the nearest covered chair. Dust rose around me. And the others? Lady Marin is in Switzerland. Lady Corinne returned to her family in France. She asked that her location remain private. Lady Seraphine. He stopped. His expression shifted into something that looked painfully like grief. Seraphine died 4 years ago, not at my hand, an infection in the facility. I had her buried near her family's estate. I paid for everything. I kept my word to her. The room was very quiet. Why, I said carefully, did you not simply tell people this? Why the secrecy? Why let the rumors? Because the women asked me to. His voice was sharp with something that was not quite anger. They were wives of a duke. Disappearing with illness, with pregnancy complications that was survivable socially. Publicly failing to carry an heir, being shipped to a foreign medical facility, having your fertility examined and monitored like a scientific subject. That was not. He looked at me directly. They chose the story. I kept it. I thought about Lady Corin quietly returned to her family in France, Lady Estelle alive in Vienna. I thought about Petra's face when she gave me the key. I thought about the crows on the gate. You should have told me, I said. Before the wedding, yes. No hesitation, no justification, just yes. I should have. I told myself I would. And then I looked at your circumstances, and I knew that if I told you the full truth, you would have walked away. And I was. He looked down at his hands. I was not entirely willing to let that happen. That was not your choice to make. No, he agreed quietly. It wasn't. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the study of the West Wing with Aldric's lamp and every journal I could open, reading until my eyes burned. Aldric himself had retreated. He'd given me the space without being asked, which I noted. He had not tried to take the photograph or the journals. He had not offered excuses beyond what he'd already said. He simply left me to decide what to do with the truth. The research was extraordinary. I am not a scientist. I had a governess education, French, piano, watercolors, and a limited survey of literature. But even I could see, reading through years of careful, obsessive documentation, that these two men, father and son, had poured decades into a problem born from grief. The elder Voss had identified something in the family's medical history that predisposed pregnancies to catastrophic failure in the 2nd trimester. Not a guarantee. A statistical pattern that spanned 6 generations of Voss women who had carried Voss heirs. And Aldric had spent 15 years quietly, doggedly, searching for a way around it. Some of the recent journals were almost hopeful. I found myself at 4 in the morning, not frightened anymore. Something stranger had replaced the fear. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a very large decision and realizing that the decision had, in some way, already been made. I had married this man. He was not a murderer. He was not a monster. He was something far more complicated and far more human. A man who had inherited catastrophe and refused to surrender to it, who had made choices both noble and wrong in the same breath, who had wanted me badly enough to protect me from a truth that should have been mine to hold from the beginning. That last part still made me furious. But fury and love are not opposites. I know that now. Sometimes they share the same room without any particular awkwardness. I found him in his study at dawn. He was at his desk, not working, just sitting, still in last night's clothes, staring at nothing in the way that people do when they're waiting for a verdict they're afraid of. He looked up when I came in. I sat in the chair across from his desk and said, I want to read everything, every journal, your father's research and yours. I want to understand what you're dealing with before we discuss what comes next. He was quiet for a long moment. And if what comes next is you leaving? He asked. Then I'll leave informed. I met his gaze, but I suspect that's not what comes next. Something shifted in his face, just slightly. Like a door opening a crack in a house that had been sealed shut for too long. Isolde, I'm not forgiving you, I said clearly. Not yet. You should have told me. That stands. But I am. I searched for the word. Staying for now. On the condition of complete honesty from this point forward. No locked doors, no managed truths, no deciding what I can and cannot handle. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the gardens. Still frost-white, still winter-hard, but beginning, just barely, to show the first pale green suggestions of something stubborn growing through the cold. Complete honesty, he repeated. Starting with whatever is in those bottles in the West Wing study, I said. He turned back around. And for the first time since I had arrived at Blackthorn Hall, Aldric Voss almost smiled. That, he said, will take some time to explain. I have time, I told him. I'm not going anywhere. Part 5. The season she stayed spring came to Blackthorn Hall the way spring always comes to places that have been cold for a long time, slowly, almost suspiciously, as if it couldn't quite believe it was allowed. The ivy on the east wall began to green. The frozen fountain in the lower garden loosened and began to murmur again. Mrs. Holt, for the first time in what Graves told me was nearly a decade, ordered fresh flowers cut for the entrance hall. Aldric and I worked. That is the only way I know to describe those months. We worked. Every evening after supper, we sat together in the now unlocked West Wing study, and he walked me through his father's research page by page, journal by journal, tonic by tonic. I asked questions, often ones that revealed exactly how limited my scientific education was, and he answered each of them without condescension. Sometimes I asked the same question 3 different ways before I understood the answer. He never lost patience. I came to understand how Aldrich showed love, with patience, with precision, with the specific tenderness of someone who had decided you were worth being careful with. It was not poetry. It was not grand gestures. It was him staying up until 2 in the morning, because I had a question about a compound he'd developed, and rewriting his explanation 5 times until I understood it, and then quietly making sure my tea was still hot while we talked. I wrote to Lady Estelle in Vienna. She wrote back, a long letter, and then another, and then we were corresponding regularly. She was remarkable. Sharp and funny and remarkably unbroken by everything she'd survived. She told me things about Aldrich that he would never have told me himself, that he'd visited her 3 times in 11 years, that he'd paid every bill without complaint, that he'd wept when she told him she didn't blame him. He carries everything, she wrote. He always has. Someone should tell him he's allowed to put some of it down. I read that letter twice. Then I folded it and kept it. That evening at supper, I told Aldrich that Lady Estelle sent her regards. He went very still. Then he said quietly, "You wrote to her?" "I did," she responded, quite enthusiastically. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. It was the first time I had done that. Initiated contact, bridged the careful distance we'd both been maintaining. "She's well. She asks that you stop being so dramatic about everything." A sound came out of him. Surprised, short, entirely undignified. It took me a moment to realize it was a laugh. It was the first time I had heard him laugh. It changed his whole face. In June, I discovered I was pregnant. I sat with that knowledge alone for 2 days before I told him. Not from fear of his reaction. I knew by then what his reaction would be. Had watched him move through the world carefully enough to read him. I kept it to myself because I needed 2 days to sit with the specific weight of it. To understand what I was feeling. What I was feeling, it turned out, was something between terror and something that was almost fierce, almost determined. When I told him he was in the garden, he'd started spending time there since spring, a habit I suspected was new, connected in some way to the fact that the house had begun to feel different with someone in it who wasn't afraid of him. He stopped moving when I said the words, just stopped, like time had briefly ceased to function. Then he turned around, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing I had ever seen from him. Raw in a way that his careful composure never allowed. Something enormous and terrified and grateful all at once. "Isolde," he said. His voice was different. "I know," I said. "I know what this means. I've read every journal. I understand the risks." "You don't have to." He stopped. Started again. "There are options. If you don't want to, Aldrich." I walked toward him, across the garden, through the smell of earth and new growth and something warm that might have been the first real summer day. "I am not Lady Estelle. I am not Lady Marin or Corinne or Seraphine." I stopped in front of him. "I have read your research. I have understood it. And I believe, based on the modifications you made in the last 18 months of your work, that you may have actually found something." He was looking at me like I was something he couldn't quite believe was real. "You think I should?" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I think we should try," I said, "together. With full honesty and no locked doors and me being part of every decision, not the subject of them." I held his gaze. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said immediately. Then, with visible effort at the honesty I had demanded, "I'm terrified. So am I." I took his hand. "That's why we'll do it together." Epilogue. What the Crows Saw the Baby was born on a Tuesday in February. Healthy, loud, magnificently indignant about the entire process in the way that only truly healthy newborns can be. A girl. Dark hair, like her father. Eyes that hadn't yet decided what color they would be. I held her in the bedroom that had once belonged to Lady Seraphine and looked at the winter garden through the window, and thought about the 4 women who had come before me. I thought about Lady Estelle in Vienna, who had sent a letter when she heard the news that made me cry in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. I thought about Lady Corinne in France, Lady Marin in Switzerland. I thought about what it meant that I had stayed when every rational instinct in a sensible woman should have said run. Aldrich sat beside the bed, not speaking, just present in the particular way that had become, over the course of 1 year and the longest winter of my life, the most familiar comfort I had ever known. His hand was warm over mine. "She needs a name," he said eventually. I looked down at the small, furious, magnificent face of my daughter. "Marin," I said. "For the woman who came before me and survived." He was quiet for a moment. "Then she'd like that." Outside, 3 crows landed on the iron gate. This time I smiled at them. Old superstition, I thought. But sometimes the warnings are wrong. Sometimes the woman who was supposed to disappear turns out to be exactly the kind of woman a cursed house has been waiting for. Someone stubborn enough to stay, brave enough to ask questions, and bold enough to believe that even the oldest patterns can be broken. Sometimes love doesn't begin with flowers and poetry and soft certainty. Sometimes it begins with crows on a gate and a locked door and a choice made in the dark. And it becomes, against all reasonable odds, the thing that changes everything.